Hi everybody, this is Sherry, and thank you for joining my channel where I am an adult with ADHD, and most of my content is about helping other adults who are neurodivergent. But this part is the part where I've been studying some medical information for a license I'm renewing, and I did the first part on the opioid crisis. I dug up some very interesting information and I thought I'd share it with you. So the first part we went over, let me just review really quick, is the timeline was the way that this particular article that I was reading to you guys said that they talked about World War II. I mean, not World War II, sorry, the Civil War. Sorry if the sound of paper is distracting. They talked about the Civil War. So they started talking about the history of the opioid epidemic in our country and the way they phrased it. In this particular article that I'm studying, they phrase it as starting in the mid 1800s. But I was curious. I wrote down, I want to say like 6 different questions. After I had that video with you guys, some things were bothering me, right? So I was kind of confused. So if we had this previous history of people becoming addicted to opioids, morphine, heroin, things like that in the early 1900s, so much so that Bayer's new medicine, they considered a wonder drug, heroin, became illegal in 1924. I was curious as to how they could forget. So some decades go by and World War II happens, probably because of all the trauma that was such, there's no words to describe the horribleness of, there's no words for World War II. No words. Horrific, horrific time in our history. And then starting in the 1980s and 1990s, which is what this one's going to be about. But so why did we start using that? I'm going to research that. But I was also curious, is the Civil War the first time that we were using opioids? And was the 1900s the first time people were becoming addicted? Well, I found out that's not the case. I found an NPR podcast. They only give you like 6 minutes, but it's enough. I thought this was so interesting to share with you guys that I actually found another phone so I can read it to you. You can find it at, if you want to listen to it yourself instead of me reading it, it is at npr.org, and the name of the podcast is from April 4th, 2019. It's called A History of Opioids in America, and I think the name of the podcast is called Throughline. I'm sure that there is a much longer episode, but they have a little snippet, and they do have a transcript. So this is interesting. Do you guys want to hear how the opioid crisis really started in our country? The first time that they ever made an opioid drug besides just using the plant, there was a pharmacist in the early 1900s in Germany, and he was the one who created it. I still have questions. So the questions that I wrote so far: how available was it to the public by prescription in the mid 1800s to 1898? Which this kind of covers. What are specific dates? It's kind of vague, right? And let's see, what else did I add? Yeah, I wanted to look up other movies for you because I thought that'd be fun. You know, how I mentioned the Winchester movie. Let's see, I was curious about how when Bayer, in the previous video I talked about this, in the article that I was learning for school, well, for my license. It is 1902. Let's see. Let me double check. When did it come out? When did it come out? They looked at it as a wonder drug. By the early 1900s. Okay. So it became illegal. All right. 1898. Bayer began marketing and commercializing heroin to the public as a pain reliever and cough suppressant. Although deemed a wonder drug, it was soon discovered to be addictive. So this is why I dug up the podcast. I was trying to dig up information because that's kind of like 50 years after the Civil War. And if these types of drugs are that addictive, it's hard for me to believe that the soldiers during the Civil War did not get addicted. Turns out they did. And there was a crisis then in the 1800s. So let me read this to you because you guys will like it. It's very interesting. So this is from the podcast. And I did dig up some other historical information about opium use in the beginning in our country and just in history as a medication in general. So for the podcast, this is some of the stuff that they were saying. The opioid crisis is awful, but not entirely new. We've heard from recent numbers. The federal government reports that more than 130 people die from opioid-related overdoses per day. Now, this podcast, if I haven't said it already, it's from 2019. So the numbers may be different because it's 2024. We'll see. We'll see. I can look up numbers for you if you're interested. Yeah, because that might have been in the middle of the third wave. So there's 3 waves of the opioid crisis currently in our recent history. And we're going to cover this too. So as far as the material I have, where are we? The first wave was in the 1990s. The second wave was in 2010. And the third wave was from 2013. And they did say when. It might have been like, yeah, so that was kind of still, the third wave was, it really hasn't, I don't think it's gone away, to be honest with you. It's so scary. It's so scary. So, okay, we've been through something. So this is what they're saying. This is not new. So I don't understand how it became so available to the public. So we've heard recent numbers. Federal government reports that more than 130 people die from opioid-related overdoses per day. We've been through something like this before, and that is the subject of the latest episode of NPR. I believe that in nursing, NPO is no food. Sorry. So NPR's history podcast, Throughline, is hosted, and you can find that. I can't pronounce the names. I will butcher them. And they learned about the first opioid crisis in American history, which happened back in the 19th century, so the 1800s. So this is before Bayer released it to the public. They're getting into the meat and potatoes. It was actually the Civil War. The Civil War is the beginning. In the early 1800s, a German pharmacist named Friedrich Sertner, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, was hard at work conducting experiments on the opium poppy plant. He was trying to figure out how to isolate its most valuable component, the alkaloid, the ingredient in the plant that gets you high, and, more importantly, for his research, provides pain relief. It was something no one had been able to do before. For years, Sertner ran all sorts of tests in the lab on stray dogs and even himself. Eventually, he cracked the code and managed to extract the alkaloid from the poppy plant. He named it morphine after the Greek god of dreams, Morpheus. I thought that was awesome. Yes, as a, we think of the Matrix, but that's really kind of cool because it does make you fall asleep if you have a lot. And for the next few years, Sertiner continued to study this new drug, this new thing. And he started getting more and more nervous about how it might be used in the future. He says, we must be very careful with this drug. Now, this is the early, is it 1800s? This is the early 1800s, guys. The early 1800s. This is 224, 20-ish, 220 years ago. How do we as a culture or as a people forget? So what I'm interested in learning, a lot of times we talk about this crisis we're having because it's horrible. Everybody knows somebody who's died. Everybody knows, it's terrible. It's so terrible. So is it big pharma? Is it the doctors who prescribe so many prescriptions? What is it? Is it everything combined? Is it us as a society? What's caused this? Well, they knew. He knew. I think that because what I read in this first article that I was reading with you guys, last video I made about this, I'm thinking he wanted to get the dose exactly right. And if you were just making the drug from the plant, there was no way to get a dose correct. And perhaps he's doing this to protect people so they don't take too much, They opened a Pandora's box. So and the fact that he knew, he was very concerned. He was very, very concerned. But he was trying to help people. That's the vibe I'm getting. Early 1800s. Let's see. So eventually he cracked the code and managed to extract the alkaloid from the poppy plant. He called it morphine after the Greek god of dreams, Morpheus. And over the next few years, Sertiner continued to study this new drug. He started getting more and more nervous about how it might be used in the future. Today. And this isn't the first time. So the first crisis, the first opioid epidemic was with soldiers in the Civil War. The second one was in the early 1900s, which I learned from this, which they talked about on the article that I had to study for an exam for keeping my license current. And then is the modern day epidemic, which started in the 90s and has had 3 waves to kind of like frame it, the time frame. Now we're going back to the early 1800s. He was very, very concerned, the person who created morphine. And I think that he was, like I said, I think he was trying to help people so you could have just the amount you needed and not more. And for the next few years, he started to study this new thing, and he started to get more and more nervous about how it might be used in the future. He says, we must be very careful with this new drug. He warns people that a calamity is around the corner. Foreshadowing. He says we must be very careful with this new drug. And so then they have a journalist come in, and her last name is Beth Macy. Her name's Beth Macy, and she is a journalist and an author based in Roanoke, Virginia. She has a book that she wrote about the crisis called Dope Sick. So if you want to learn more, go to Amazon or your local bookstore or wherever they sell that and look for Dope Sick by Beth Macy. And if you guys read it, let me know, because that would be really cool to find out. Okay, so she says, several decades after morphine is discovered, Sertiner's fears are realized. So this is just a couple decades after the early 1800s. I think it was like 1804 or 1805 is when he finally was able to nail it down. I'm not sure how long between then and that it was available for doctors, but this is what it says. Several decades after morphine is discovered, searchers' fears are realized. Calamity strikes an ocean away in the United States. The Civil War begins. So I'm not sure which date the Civil War begins, so any history buffs, let us know. I just know from this, and I don't remember from school, that it was in the mid-1800s. It's an incredibly bloody war, the deadliest in American history up to that point. Well, yeah, not counting like, when we travel, like World War II. And most of these deaths actually happened off the battlefield from things like disease and infection. This is what I was wondering about in my first video I did for you guys. And I haven't looked it up yet. I'm curious as to when it became knowledgeable about germs. Because I don't think during the Civil War, when they were treating soldiers on the battlefield and they were using implements to do amputations, I don't think that they cleaned them well. I think they probably just wiped them off and went to the next person and did that. But it says that most of the deaths happened off the battlefield from things like disease and infections. But there was this great new way of controlling pain, this new drug, morphine. And the U.S. imported a lot of it. Many soldiers became hooked and stayed hooked after the war ended. There's a saying or a cliche that morphine addiction in the late 19th century was the army disease or the soldier's disease. So the article I was reading to you guys talked about that it was used in the Civil War, but they didn't say that there was any addiction or crisis until it was released by Bayer. They didn't in the late 1800s to early 1900s there. But this is the mid 1800s. That's what I would think, Oh no, mosquitoes are starting to come out. So it says this is, drug historian David Courtwright, he is speaking on the podcast, and he says that the nickname hides a significant detail, which is other evidence suggests very strongly that the majority of addicts ended up being women. So Courtwright says, while a lot of the soldiers did return from the front addicted to morphine, it appears that as the century went on, women made up the majority of morphine addicts in the U.S. Why was morphine prescribed in the 19th century? That's the 1800s. It's prescribed for all kinds of pain, which women tended to be diagnosed with to a much greater degree than men. So now it's Nancy Campbell. She's a historian of drugs and drug addiction. Men were expected to bear pain more stoically. They were not expected to seek out doctors for every ache and pain. There were also supposed racial differences in the ability to tolerate pain. So this is showing how the attitudes were back then in the 1800s. We know a lot about the racism back then and their attitudes and how they felt about things. And so if you were a white woman who could afford a prescription, so the well-to-do elite who could afford prescription drugs, and you went to the doctor for, say, a cough or menstrual cramps, you were way more likely to leave with a prescription for morphine than anyone else. One doctor, oh my God, guys. One doctor, Frederick Heman Hubbard, wrote in 1881, uterine and ovarian complications cause more ladies to fall into the opium habit than all other diseases combined. So this was big stuff back then. And this is 1800s. So morphine was the catch-all drugs that doctors and pharmacists used for pretty much everything. They prescribed it to women like Ms. Matilda Webster. Guys, this gets scary, and there's a lawsuit. She dies. And the pharmacist goes on trial. Actually, it wasn't a lawsuit. They took him to trial. I think it was a criminal trial. So, Ms. Matilda Webster, mother of 9 children who suffered from neuralgia. Neuralgia is painful nerves. Algia is pain. Neur is nerves. Neuralgia is a condition where nerve pain causes a stabbing, burning sensation. She sent, one night, she was in so much pain that she sent one of her 9 children to Boyd's Pharmacy, which was her usual South Brooklyn drugstore. And the child reported to the druggist, the pharmacist, that her mother was in great pain, bodily pain, and was asking for something to help her just go to sleep. The pharmacist, who was pretty familiar with Mrs. Webster, packaged up a couple doses of morphine. I think that he gave instructions to the child probably instead of writing it down. I don't know. Maybe it was she just didn't know. As Mrs. Webster, instead of doing what the druggist thought she would do, which was take a little at a time until her pain went away, instead of taking a big dose, she took the whole supply at once. They said that he gave her a couple of doses. How many doses did they say just now? Let me see. Do we say? A child reported the druggist that the mother was in great pain. It says a couple of doses, so I don't know how many, but she took them all. And Mrs. Webster, instead of doing what the druggist thought she would do, was taking a little bit at a time. She took everything, the whole supply. So she overdosed. She went into a coma and lingered in a comatose state and passed away 24 hours later. She had overdosed on morphine, and the pharmacist who gave her the morphine was put on trial, which Campbell said was unusual because overdoses normally were reported as deaths by natural causes, but Matilda's husband was not willing to let it go and eventually was given $5,000. In 1868, that's a long time ago. So they knew about this a long time ago. 1868, so not long after the Civil War ended, people were already starting to suspect that morphine was potentially dangerous. Like, warning, this drug is not safe. One doctor wrote in 1884, prompt active action is then demanded, lest our land should become stupefied by the direful effects of narcotics and thus disease physically, mentally, and morally, the love of liberty swallowed up by the love of opium, while the masses of our people would become fit subjects for a despot. I guess we're seeing how they spoke back then. So this is going to cut me off momentarily, and I'm actually going to film the second part, third part right after this. Still, the doctors kept prescribing morphine throughout the 1800s. So what was that, 1868? Oh, this one was 1884. They still prescribed it through the 1800s despite warnings, mostly because there just weren't any good alternatives. That's what I was thinking. I mean, aspirin wasn't even marketed until 1899. By the early 20th century, the 1900s, tens of thousands of Americans were addicted to narcotics like morphine. People were dying of overdoses, which sounds pretty familiar. Yeah, a lot like the crisis we are in today. People would go to the doctor's office, they would get a prescription for maybe morphine, become addicted, and maybe even die. And communities who are mostly white were left devastated. It doesn't matter who it was. Everybody is devastated by the drug crisis. And the government was left scrambling to find some kind of solution. Because when you have people addicted or dying in communities, it ultimately impacts the entire country. So just like now, the morphine crisis probably had a lot of people asking, oh my Lord, what have we unleashed in this country? The very latest on the past from Throughline is hosted by Ramtin Arablouei and Rond Al Abdel. I'm not even going to try. So it's Throughline, it's NPR. You guys, go find it. And this one was from 2019. And in case I didn't say earlier, this is a history of opioids in America. And I hope you guys have enjoyed this. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.